When I signed up for Uber Eats, I never imagined it would lead to one of the most terrifying nights of my life. It started in 2021 when I was struggling to make ends meet after being laid off from my job. Uber Eats seemed like a lifeline, a flexible gig that allowed me to hustle and pay off my mounting student loans. I mostly stuck to the dinner rush and late-night deliveries since they paid better and had less traffic. On this particular night, I was working the late shift in Wilmington, North Carolina. The streets were eerily quiet, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Around midnight, I accepted an order from a fast food restaurant. The delivery was headed to a house in a more rural part of town, about a 20-minute drive from the restaurant. I didn't think much of it at the time. Late-night orders to quiet neighborhoods weren't unusual, and I was focused on making a few more dollars before calling it a night. The house in the dark as I left the more populated part of Wilmington. The streetlights became fewer, and the houses more spread out. Eventually, the GPS directed me onto a narrow, winding road that was completely engulfed in darkness. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches casting ominous shadows. When I turned onto a dead-end street, I felt a twinge of unease. The house I was delivering to was at the very end of the road, and it stood in total darkness. No porch light, no glowing windows, just an ominous silhouette against the night sky. I parked my car, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the path. The overgrown grass brushed against my legs as I made my way to the front door, clutching the food bag in one hand and my phone in the other. Using the flashlight on my phone, I navigated the uneven path. When I reached the porch, I noticed the doorbell didn't seem to work, so I knocked instead. A chill ran down my spine as I waited in the oppressive silence. I messaged the customer through the app, letting them know I was at the door and asking for confirmation of the address. Almost immediately, I saw the message had been read. A reply came quickly. "Give me a second." Something's not right, I waited, expecting to see a light turn on inside the house or hear footsteps approaching the door. But there was nothing. I sent another message, asking them to confirm the address, and they replied, "I see you. You're at the right house." That message made my stomach drop. The house was dark, completely lifeless. How could they see me? I stepped back from the door, scanning the yard and the windows with my flashlight. That's when I realized there were no cars in the driveway, no sign of anyone living there. A sickening sense of dread washed over me. Then I heard a voice coming from the darkness. "Over here," it called, low and raspy. I froze, my flashlight darting toward the sound, but there was no one there. "I'm leaving the food on the porch," I shouted, my voice trembling. The voice responded, "No, bring it here." My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, turning toward my car. But as I approached it, a horrifying realization set in. The sound of air hissing reached my ears, and I saw that both tires on the driver's side had been slashed. Trapped panic set in as I checked the other side. All 4 tires were flat. Someone had sabotaged my car. I jumped inside, locking the doors and fumbling with my phone to call for help. Before I could dial, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. 4 figures emerged from the shadows, each wearing masks that obscured their faces. They surrounded my car, standing at each window, blocking any chance of escape. "Get out of the car," one of them shouted, pounding on the driver's side window. I screamed, pleading with them to let me go. One of them stepped closer, holding a crowbar, and another banged on the hood of the car. "Get out now," they repeated, their voices growing more aggressive. Terrified, I shouted, "Take whatever you want. Just let me go." The moment I unlocked the door, they dragged me out, and the beating began. Kicks, punches, they didn't hold back. Pain shot through my body as they stripped me of everything: my wallet, phone, shoes, even my smartwatch. They rifled through my glove compartment, taking anything of value. When they finally left, I lay there on the cold ground, barely conscious. My vision blurred, and the world around me faded into darkness. The aftermath, when I came to, I had no idea how much time had passed. My body ached, and I could barely move. My car was still there, but the keys were gone, and so was any hope of driving away. I forced myself to stand, stumbling toward the faint glow of a house further up the road. When I reached it, I banged on the door, praying someone would answer. A woman's voice called out from inside, asking who it was. "I've been robbed," I stammered, barely able to get the words out. "I need to call the police." Thankfully, she let me in and handed me her phone. I called the police, and then my dad, who rushed to pick me up. The officers arrived and took my statement. They found the house I had delivered to completely empty. It had been vacant for months. The customer account on the Uber Eats app was traced back to a stolen phone and wallet. The people who attacked me had planned everything, using a fake delivery to lure me to a remote location. A painful lesson. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, insurance claims, and hospital visits. My car was eventually towed and repaired, but the emotional scars ran deeper than the financial losses. I took a break from Uber Eats for a while, too shaken to continue. When I finally went back, I only accepted daytime deliveries in well-lit, populated areas. This experience taught me a hard lesson about trust and vigilance. In hindsight, there were red flags in unlit house, the vague messages, but I ignored them, desperate to finish the job and make my money. Never again will I let my guard down so easily. And if you're reading this, I hope my story serves as a warning. Be careful out there. You never know what dangers might be waiting in the shadows. The creepy delivery night, I used to deliver pizzas for a small, family-owned pizzeria called Leonardo's. It wasn't a glamorous job, but as a college student in 2009, it paid the bills. My boss, John, usually worked the night shift with me, assigning deliveries as orders came in. One evening, as the clock ticked closer to the end of my shift, we received an order for 2 pizzas. John handed me a slip with an address and a phone number. Back then, I didn't have the luxury of GPS on my phone, just a flip phone for calls and texts. For directions, I relied on a worn map book that had seen better days. The address was somewhere deep in a rural area outside of town, on a street called Willows Road. It didn't seem far at first glance, so I grabbed the pizzas, hopped in my car, and set off. A dark and twisting road, the further I drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. The streetlights disappeared, replaced by dense woods on either side of the road. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the road twisted and turned unpredictably. I pulled over multiple times to consult the map, squinting under the dim interior light of my car. Anxiety bubbled up as I struggled to locate the address. When I was about to give up, I decided to call the phone number on the slip. It rang for what felt like an eternity, and just as I was about to hang up, someone answered. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky from frustration and nerves. "Hello," came the reply. The voice was low, deep, and eerily calm. "This is the pizza guy. I'm having trouble finding your house," I explained. The person on the other end spoke slowly, almost too slowly. "The driveway is easy to miss. It looks like a dirt trail. There's an old mailbox next to it." With those directions, I eventually found the narrow, overgrown driveway. My car rocked as I carefully navigated the bumpy path. After about 30 seconds of slow driving, A small, dimly lit house emerged from the shadows. A battered pickup truck was parked nearby. The faint orange glow from a window was the only sign of life. First impressions. I grabbed the pizzas and approached the front door, searching for a doorbell but finding none. I knocked lightly. From inside, I could hear faint music, something old, perhaps from the 1930s. The footsteps that followed were slow and deliberate. After what felt like an eternity, the door cracked open, revealing a sliver of a man's face. Only one eye was visible, peering out at me. "Hey, you ordered the pizza, right?" I asked nervously. "Oh, yes. The pizza," he said, his voice matching the one from the phone. He paused, staring at me in silence, before adding, "Let me get the cash." He disappeared into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear his footsteps retreating, but the longer he took, the more uneasy I became. I glanced inside. The room was dimly lit, furnished with what looked like relics from another era. A vintage record player sat in the corner, its horn amplifying the hauntingly scratchy music. The air smelled musty, like decay. The door creaked open further, seemingly on its own. "Something's off." As I waited, I called out, "Sir?" My voice trembled slightly. From another room, the man replied, "Yes, could you come into the kitchen, please?" His request sent a chill down my spine. My boss had always warned us never to enter a customer's house. I hesitated. "Could you bring the cash here instead?" I asked. He repeated, "Come into the kitchen, please." This time louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The floor groaned under my weight, and the smell intensified. My heart raced as I scanned the dimly lit room. To my right, the entrance to the kitchen beckoned, but something down the narrow hallway to my left caught my eye. A man stood at the end of the hall with his back to me, swaying unnaturally. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost like he was dancing, but in a way that felt entirely wrong. My throat tightened as he began to run his hands over his body, his movements unsettling and grotesque. Face in the shadows, I tore my gaze away and took a cautious step toward the kitchen. Before I could make it far, something made me freeze in place. From around the corner of the kitchen wall, the man I'd spoken to earlier was peeking out, just as he had at the door. Only a fraction of his face was visible, one eye gleaming in the dim light. "Do you have the cash?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a normal laugh, it was soft, almost wheezing, but filled with malice. Then he yelled, "Randall!" His voice boomed, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped the pizzas. Fight or flight, I had reached my breaking point. Without waiting for an explanation, I turned and headed for the door. My instincts screamed at me to leave. As I reached the front door, I glanced back down the hallway. The dancing man was no longer swaying. He stood motionless, staring directly at me. My heart hammered as I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. The cool night air hit my face like a slap, but my relief was short-lived. The door creaked open again behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I sprinted to my car, threw the pizzas onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I backed up, I scanned the house one last time. The front door was wide open now, but no one was standing there. The shadows inside seemed to shift and move on their own. Aftermath, I sped down the dirt driveway and didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, replaying the events in my mind. When I finally returned to the pizzeria, John noticed my pale face immediately. "What happened?" he asked. I recounted the entire story. At first, my coworkers laughed, thinking it was some kind of prank. But as I described the eerie details, the men's strange behavior, the smell, the decaying house, their laughter faded. John wasn't angry about the undelivered pizzas. In fact, he told me I had done the right thing by leaving. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed in that house. But I've had nightmares about that man's face, peeking out from behind walls, his eye watching me, and that haunting laugh echoing in the darkness. After that, I made a vow never to step inside a customer's house again. Whatever was happening in that house that night wasn't normal, and I was lucky to get out unscathed. I was always the type of person to work late. The quiet hours were ideal for getting tasks done, and there was something oddly peaceful about the solitude. I had worked countless night shifts in various places, but this one was different. This time, I was delivering for DoorDash, and things took a horrifying turn. It was a Tuesday night, or perhaps Wednesday, hard to remember the exact day. The time was just after 2 o'clock, and I was cruising down the highway on my way to a delivery, feeling the exhaustion from the long shift, but also that second wind you get after chugging down a few coffees earlier in the day. The roads were empty, the streets were quiet, and the night felt almost too peaceful. It was every delivery driver's dream. The destination was in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I knew the streets like the back of my hand, just another typical residential area with houses neatly lined up. I pulled up to the house on a small cul-de-sac and parked my car in the driveway. As I got out and made my way to the front door, I couldn't shake off a strange feeling that seemed to hang in the air. My stomach felt tight, and I brushed it off as just my imagination running wild. I rang the doorbell and knocked lightly, but when no one answered after a few seconds, I knocked again, this time louder. No reply. I wasn't surprised. It wasn't uncommon for customers to be either asleep or distracted when I showed up at odd hours. I glanced around the neighborhood. Everything was still. The houses around me were dark, with no signs of life. I looked back at the front door and noticed something strange. The door was cracked open. Not by much, but enough for me to see inside. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was meant for me or just the usual state of the house. My job was simple: drop off the food, collect the payment, and move on to the next. But something didn't sit right. "Hello?" I called out as I lightly stepped forward and knocked again, a bit more firmly this time. "Delivery for the Johnsons?" I waited, but no one responded. That's when I heard it thumps. It sounded muffled, almost like someone was banging on a door somewhere in the house, but the sound came from deeper inside. I froze. The thump echoed again, followed by silence. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the doorbell again and pressed it, more out of instinct than anything. Just then, the door creaked open a little further, and a man appeared from down the hallway. He looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as though he had been lying down for a while. He didn't greet me. Instead, he walked toward the door with a strange, bothered expression on his face. "Yeah, I'm here for the food," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was racing. The whole situation was giving me a bad feeling. The man didn't say anything in response. Instead, he just stared at me for a long moment, his eyes focused on my face. The silence stretched between us, awkward and tense. Then suddenly, there was another series of thumps, this time louder. I glanced over his shoulder, trying to make sense of the noise, but the man didn't look back. His expression changed, his eyes flicking toward the hallway, and his face went from annoyed to something else, fear, maybe, or anger, I couldn't tell. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he just stared past me, at the hallway, as though he was contemplating something. I could feel a lump in my throat as my nerves started to flare. Why wouldn't he answer me? What was going on inside that house? The thumps were getting louder now, almost rhythmic, but the man was still silent, his gaze fixed on the hallway. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Why don't you come inside and drop it off?" The request took me by surprise. It wasn't unusual for customers to ask me to come inside, but something about this man's tone was different, demanding, almost like he was trying to coerce me into doing something I wasn't comfortable with. My gut told me not to go in. I hesitated, my mind racing. "No, it's fine. I can just leave it here," I said quickly, but he didn't seem to care. Before I could react, he reached out and snatched the bag from my hands, his grip tight and forceful. The door slammed shut before I could say anything else. I stood there in shock, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? I was about to leave when the thumping sound started up again, this time even louder than before. My instincts screamed at me to get away. I turned on my heel and rushed down the porch steps, heading back to my car. My hands were shaking, but I managed to get inside and start the engine. The moment I pulled out of the driveway and turned onto the main road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Two men, running out from behind the house, sprinted through the bushes, heading straight toward me. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. I slammed the accelerator to the floor, not even daring to look in my rearview mirror. The road ahead seemed endless as I sped through the night, my heart hammering in my chest. I was halfway down the street when I stumbled over something, tripping and falling hard on the pavement. My head hit the ground, but I quickly scrambled back to my feet, adrenaline surging through me. I kept running, pushing my body to the limit, the sounds of footsteps closing in on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I finally reached my car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut. I turned the engine over and peeled out of there as fast as I could. When I looked in my side mirror, the men had stopped in their tracks, disappearing back into the shadows where they came from. I drove for what felt like hours, my body still trembling from the adrenaline, my mind replaying the events over and over. I immediately called my boss and told him what happened. He was concerned, and I could hear the worry in his voice. He told me to call the police, so I did. The police launched an investigation and interviewed both me and my boss. We filed a report, but they never found the two men. The property where the house stood was state-owned, and the trespassing sign at the end of the road had been dug up and tossed into the tall grass. The whole situation was strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those men had been up to something sinister. Even though the police couldn't find them, I was relieved that I'd managed to get away. I just hoped no one else would have to go through what I did, and if they did, I hoped they would be as lucky as I was to escape. That night still haunts me. The thumping, the demand to come inside, and the men chasing me, every detail stays with me. I'll never forget the way it felt to be so close to danger, to have no idea what those men's intentions were. And in the end, we may never know what was really happening inside that house. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. I hadn't gotten a good enough look at him to offer any real details, so I grabbed my things, clocked out, and rushed to my car. I'm thankful, looking back, that I decided to drive that night instead of biking. I tossed my bike into the trunk and locked the car, my heart still pounding in my chest. The drive home was uneventful, thank God, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be following me, but no one did. I made it home safe. Safe, but shaken. I never saw that man again. I don't know what he wanted, whether he was looking to rob me or something worse. All I know is that whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. I haven't worked another midnight shift since then, and I never will. Now, I always carry nunchucks with me whenever I work late. It's a small comfort, but it's enough to give me a little peace of mind. New York is supposed to be a city of opportunity, not danger. It's not known for being a place where things like this happen. But that night, I learned something that no amount of city lights or busy streets can change. Anything can happen, anywhere, to anyone, at any time, no matter how safe or dangerous the place may seem.